as you came in today, I hope you got one. If not, there should be some in the back. It's a devotional for Christmas. One of the things about Advent is that it is a time of expectation. But in small group today, we talked about how we prepare our hearts for Christmas. We think very much about preparing our hearts for Easter through the Lent process. This is a good time for us to also prepare our hearts as we move, okay, with Christmas. And so this is a way for you to do it. It's simple. It's code words. It's a title is done by O.S. Hawkins. And help move you along. And so that's really kind of our theme as we're moving through this Advent season. Here in just a minute, if you're following along in your Bibles, Micah chapter 5. So go to Matthew and start backing up, okay? Start moving into the Old Testament. I think after Micah is Nahum. All right? It's about four books backwards out of Matthew. He's one of the minor prophets. All right, so how many of you have shopped online for Christmas? Less hands than I thought, actually. How many of you have already had something delivered to your house? Yeah, okay, there you go. So as we get a little closer to Christmas, if you're like me and you delay your shopping process, okay, sooner or later you'll start looking that deliver by date, right? We're looking for that guaranteed delivery, aren't we? It'll be here. I know it's Christmas Eve, but it'll be here, right? No, I might have done that in my life, okay? See, the reality is that promise may or may not be true, right? All we need is the snow that moved across the northern part of our country, and there were cancellations and movements, and that means Amazon isn't going to get it to you, right? Becky set it up well about, have we ever made a promise and not been able to keep it? I've made promises. I've said I would do something and not complete said task. We all have. But it's amazing to me when I start looking at the promises of God that I can see that they were always fulfilled. That in His providence, as He was saying, I'm going to do this, we can understand. Now, I'll tell you, as we read Isaiah and we read Micah and we read some of these other pieces, we are looking back with a lens that we can see Christ a little more clearly. Okay? And we have to understand when we read these things, Micah is living in Judah. The king for most of his time is Ahaz. I think that's right. Okay, and he is speaking, the Assyrians are overrunning Israel, and they're going to go into captivity. All right, and he's the voice crying out in the midst of it. But yet when we read back, we can also all of a sudden start to see the promise of the Christ child. We can start to see not only the promise of the Christ child, but we can start to see the promises that will come later of His death and His resurrection, of His second return. There's something about that. And you know what? The delivery is guaranteed. He's batting 1,000. I've been to bat in more than one or two games in my life. I do not hit 1,000. Even in slow pitch church softball. Seems like you should, right? But you know what? God's promises are always fulfilled. They're always there. His answers are always there. And it ought to change how we move. Listen at what Micah says, and I'll try to point out, I'm going to give you both how we read back looking on this side of Christ coming and how they heard it. Okay? Because there's a twofold bit to this prophecy here. Starting in verse 2, he said, "But you, Bethlehem, Ephrath, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel. Those origins are from of old, from ancient times. Therefore, Israel will be abandoned until the time when she who is in labor bears a son, and the rest of his brothers return to join the Israelites. And he will stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. And they will live securely, for then his greatness will reach to the ends of the earth. And he will be our peace. I start to read that and I start to hear pieces, and you probably could too, looking back. Bethlehem. The son's going to come out of Bethlehem. The king is going to come out of Bethlehem. We see it again in Isaiah that it tells us that it'll come out of the root of Jesse. This promise of the Messiah coming is going to come out of the town of Bethlehem. And yet in God's providence and in his will and in his foreknowledge, all of a sudden he sees what's going to happen, and it can make these promises that impact us today over 2,000 years later. He knew that Mary and Joseph would have to go back to Nazareth, from Nazareth to Bethlehem. The child would be born right there. The people from Micah's time, they hear this piece out of David's lineage, right? Coming back. All of a sudden he says, you out of Judah will hear it. Matthew chapter 2. Talked about this in small group as well today. It's interesting when you start to look at, it's not Matthew 2, it's Matthew 1. Sorry. And you start to look at it, one of the pieces we don't ever preach out of, I've done it once and it didn't go great, by the way, is to look at this genealogy. And it is out of this that we can go back to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and we can start to see the promises of God fulfilled out. And we see them even as Matthew writes. He wants the Israelites to know, this is who was talked about in Isaiah. This is who was talked about in Micah. This is the very Messiah that we have been waiting on. The problem is it's a little different than the Messiah they were looking for. When they hear new ruler, they hear David like king. Somebody who's going to restore the walls of Bethlehem and Jerusalem, that's going to defeat the Assyrians, that they won't go into exile. Man, what does it look like for them? The second part of verse 2, or the very end of it, it says, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times. The king has been there the whole time. The Messiah has been there the whole time. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, God says, he goes, let us make man in our image. Let us. For me, all of a sudden when I hear that I see God in the Trinity, because I can look back, because the Holy Spirit has been revealed to us through the New Testament. The Messiah has been revealed to us through the New Testament. And all of a sudden I can actually understand why that's in the Hebrew, that is a plural, us. And almost every translation puts us in it. All of a sudden we realize the Messiah promised in Micah was there at the very beginning. My mind immediately, when I heard that, I was reading and studying this week, my mind then flashed to John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word was God. He was with God, and in the very beginning, nothing was created without Him. I can hear the echoes of the promises. Because see, I continue to see what God is promising, God is doing. He's batting 1,000. So, God of ancient times. Again, the people of Israel are probably hearing David coming back through that line. Then, she who is in labor bears a son. You hear your son? I think the Jewish people probably were excited. They longed to somebody to be Mary, for somebody to be the one who would bring the Messiah into this world. And Micah's going, there's going to be one. There's going to be that moment in that time. Over and over, we hear Christ referred to as the shepherd. He said he's going to shepherd his people. You hear Psalms 23, right? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He restoreth my soul. We hear it. I hear Jesus saying, I am the good shepherd. My sheep will know my voice. When I speak, they will know and come. See, the promises of God, of who he is and what he will be like. I hear the master, the shepherd, who says, I got 100 sheep, and I know the 99 are safe. I'm going to go get the one. The shepherd. I'm going to risk. What would it look like when I start to realize that God is making promises to me and he's still fulfilling them today? That the promises that he made long ago will still be filled out. I got to see which one was next. And he talks about, he says that this new reign would be ever ending. My mind went to Genesis chapter 12. The promise to Abraham that I will make your line from you, the whole world will be blessed. And it will be as many as the sands on the seashore. Some of you go get 1 cup of sand and count every grain. Try that one on, JC. JC says, no thanks. But see, the blessing and the promise of Christ, we hear it over and over. It's going to be there. We'll live. In verse 4, it goes on, he'll stand up as shepherds in the strength of the Lord and the majesty of his name, and we will live securely, for then his greatness will reach the ends of the earth. The Christ lifted up. We're going to celebrate communion today. His promise of grace and forgiveness. Him raised up for you and I. And he will be our peace. Typically with Advent, we do hope, peace, love, and joy. And we're going to do some different words this year. Well, I'm always mindful that in the midst of no matter where we are, and the people from Micah are in a place of despair. And he says, and the king will provide you peace. The Messiah will provide you peace. In the midst of facing exile, being ripped up and taken away from their home, he says, and I will provide you peace. He does not promise that it will be easy. He says, but that I will be with you. And all of a sudden I hear Jesus saying, and I will be with you always to the ends of the age. I'll never leave you, never forsake you. Oh, the promise of his peace. In the midst of no matter whatever is happening. So the reality is that while this promise is of the Messiah, it is also of the promise of the Messiah of what will happen. The celebration of Christmas is the beginning, and it leads to Easter. It leads to the cross. In verse 1, the bottom of it, it said, they will strike Israel's ruler on the cheek with a rod. And I can't not get the promise of the Messiah, of what it takes Jesus has to look at his disciples how many times, hey, I know it is coming. I'm going to the cross. I am going to that. They're going, what? Wait a second. We didn't sign up for that, Jesus. He said, but I've told you that the Son of Man had to be lifted up. And see, all of a sudden, I hear the promises of John chapter 14. We read it at funerals all the time. He says, I am going to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you in my Father's house, which have many rooms, I'll come back and get you. See, it's the promise of what's going to happen. And all of a sudden I can start to hear that, and I can start to hear Revelations chapter 21. He said, and I saw a new heaven and a new earth. There's everything that was has been made new. There's no more tears, no more pain. See, the promises of God, what he promises, he does. Let me see if I can say it a little different to give you a theological piece. He says we can have faith or hope because God keeps his promises. See, what God promises, God does. What he says he will do, he does. And all of a sudden, that means that my faith in that moment, when I walk in doubt, when I walk in going, God, how's this going to be? I can realize that his love is still there. That he is still walking with me. That while the Israelites struggled right here. Matter of fact, Micah goes on to tell them, he says, they're like, God, what is even worthy of you in chapter 6 of coming and worshiping? How many calves do we need to bring? And it is so bad in their own society of who's turning against Israel in itself. It says, don't trust your family in Micah 7. What he's saying to us today is, though, no matter what the situation is, he goes, I've promised you a Messiah. He's come. I've promised you a Messiah that would die for you. We're going to celebrate his grace and his forgiveness and his love. And he says, and I've also promised you a Messiah that will return. And so that means in a world that every time I turn on the news, I see rioting in the streets. I see political chaos. I look at Hong Kong and China and Iraq right now. And I think of the own strife, the own separation between our political parties. No matter where you fall. And we probably got some of both in here. In our own place. We're way out here. And he says, and I love you. I have shown it by sending you the Christ child. I've shown it by dying for you. And I'm going to show it when I come back. Because see, God has made us lots of promises. And every time I start to dig into them, I keep finding that he is faithful and true. Over and over. What would it look like if you walked knowing that he was going to continue to answer his promises? How would that change how you approach Christmas this year? How you approach this Advent season? The season of expectation. There's a difference in hoping I get something and knowing I'll get it, isn't there? I wanted that first Atari. I was hoping to get the first Atari. It had the one little stick, Pong. Yeah. And the difference of knowing that my Christ is coming back and that he died for me. I managed to get that first Atari and get cramps in my hands playing it so long. But I didn't know. The reality is I don't know when Christ is coming. That's an open-ended piece. Again, he tells us it's not for man to know that when I shall return. But I don't wonder whether he's going to. I know. Because God will bat 1,000. because he has, and he will continue. So I hope this week as you walk, as you go out into this world, that you may walk with faith and assurance what God has promised you and how he has already loved you and how he will continue. Because we respond a little differently, don't we? When we know something. I hope my kids, when I snarled at them this week as we were trying to prepare for the 6th Thanksgiving meal. Yes, I ate Thanksgiving dinner 6 times. Okay? I might have been a little snarly by Wednesday evening. That their response was that they, even through the snarls, they know Daddy loved them. So their response was much kinder because they know the grandpapa loves them. Sorry, that's what I want to be called when I'm a grandpa. It's grandpapa. Okay? I won't drill your kids till they say that, okay? But the reality is, when we know somebody loves us, we respond a little differently. And God, by keeping his promises, is saying, I love you. Walk with that assurance this week. Because all of a sudden your faith looks a little differently. Your hope looks a little differently. Let me pray for you. And we'll get to celebrate one of his promises and one of his grace through communion this morning. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for allowing us to be in your house. But Lord, help us to walk in a way that we walk with confidence, knowing you love us. You have loved us from the very beginning of time, and you will love us until we, all the way through eternity. Amen. I'm going to ask those.